Jackson had always found himself out of place among the usual diplomats. Where others saw negotiations as a battlefield, he saw them as an opportunity to listen, to understand, and to connect. This wasn't a quality commonly found in diplomats, especially those representing powerful intergalactic alliances like the Terran Confederation. But Jackson was no ordinary diplomat. He was a xenobiologist, a student of alien cultures, and a man, driven by curiosity rather than politics. Today, Jackson stood on the massive docks of Vantari Prime, staring at the towering structures of the city, with an unease that was not entirely uncommon for him. His mission was simple enough on the surface: help mediate peace talks between the Terran Confederation and the Vantari, a race known for their powerful warriors and their deeply entrenched traditions. The Vantari had been in conflict for decades, their empire stretched thin and their population dwindling due to an alarming decline in birth rates. What was once a proud, mighty race was now teetering on the edge of extinction. And the Federation, recognizing this, had decided to send Jackson to offer assistance. It was easy to see why the Confederation chose him. He was quiet, diplomatic, and, above all, a curious observer. His vast knowledge of alien species would allow him to navigate the complexity of Vantari culture in a way that no regular negotiator could. But Jackson knew that this mission was far from simple. The Vantari were not like other races. They were ancient, proud, and their society was built on traditions older than any human had ever known. As he stepped off the shuttle and onto the cracked ground of Vantari Prime, Jackson could already feel the weight of the planet's oppressive atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of dust and metal, and the horizon stretched endlessly in front of him, interrupted only by the sharp, jagged silhouettes of the city's towering spires. In the distance, he could hear the soft hum of engines and the clattering of machinery, but otherwise the planet was eerily quiet. The Vantari were a race of warriors, but this wasn't a battle he had prepared for. This was a fight of tradition and change. The shuttle door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and a group of Vantari warriors stepped forward. Their towering figures cast long shadows across the landing platform. These were not the kind of men you crossed, Jackson thought. Their sheer size and strength were intimidating, their hard eyes scanning every movement, every gesture. They were the guardians of their culture, and they were here to escort him to the heart of their empire, the capital city, Silarth, where the peace talks would take place. Jackson's hand gripped the strap of his bag as he followed them, his eyes flicking from one warrior to the next. These men were the definition of strength, their muscular frames covered in black armor, adorned with intricate designs that spoke to their heritage. The Vantari were a proud race, but Jackson was no fool. He knew there was more to them than just strength. Beneath the exterior of harsh warriors was a society struggling to survive. And if he was to succeed in his mission, he needed to understand that society, especially the parts of it that no one spoke of. The journey to the city was short, though the silence between Jackson and the Vantari was not. There were no formal greetings, no polite exchanges. The warriors simply led him through the barren landscape, their heavy footsteps echoing in the stillness. The city eventually came into view, a massive labyrinth of towering structures and winding streets. It looked like a place of great power, but there was a strange emptiness to it, like a once vibrant empire now facing the reality of its decline. When they reached the city's gates, Jackson was escorted into the grand halls of the Vantari Council. The air inside the hall was thick, with tension. He could feel it in the way the warriors stood at attention, their eyes never leaving him. It was clear that this wasn't just another diplomatic meeting for the Vantari. This was a critical moment in their history, and they didn't trust the humans to get it right. They didn't trust anyone to save them from themselves. At the front of the room stood the matriarch, the leader of the Vantari females. She was a woman of unimaginable power and influence, and yet there was something about her that seemed out of place. The Vantari had always revered their females, but their power had always been hidden behind walls of tradition. The females were sacred, but they were also prisoners of their own culture. Jackson knew about the Vantari's tradition of keeping their females hidden from the rest of society. The males were free to roam the battlefields, but the females were kept out of sight, revered but locked away. It was an unspoken rule, an ancient law that no one dared break. And yet here he was, standing in a room full of Vantari warriors with the matriarch herself watching him, and he was about to make the most important decision of his life. He had to make them see beyond their rigid traditions. He had to make them understand that change was not their enemy, but their only hope. As the meeting began, Jackson's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unexpected presence. Standing at the back of the room was a woman, a Vantari female who appeared different from the others. She was taller, more regal, and her eyes, those eyes, locked with Jackson's. There was something in those eyes that spoke of untold stories, of a life lived in silence, a life constrained by the chains of tradition. She was Zarika, the eldest of the Hira, and Jackson could see that she was more than just a figurehead in Vantari society. She was the key to unlocking the future of her people. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath as Jackson acknowledged her. It wasn't a gesture of disrespect or rebellion, but rather a simple act of recognition. He wasn't supposed to acknowledge her presence. No one ever did, but he did. And in that moment, everything changed. The room fell silent. The warriors, stiffened and Zarika, silent for so long, nodded back at him. Jackson had no idea what he had just done. He only knew one thing: the galaxy had no idea what was coming next. And neither did the Vantari. The encounter in the council hall had left a strange tension hanging in the air, one that seemed to whisper through every corner of the grand building. Jackson had never expected his simple act of acknowledging Zarika to stir such a deep current of unrest. It was an innocent gesture, something he had done countless times in his life, but in this place, it felt like the breaking of an ancient law, a law that no one had dared to challenge for centuries. The Vantari, with their rigid sense of honor and tradition, were not accustomed to outsiders acknowledging their females, let alone with such respect. And yet, that was exactly what Jackson had done. As the meeting continued, the tension seemed to escalate. The Vantari warriors, once stoic and unwavering, now seemed uneasy. Their gazes darted from Jackson to Zarika, as though they were waiting for some sort of response, something that could ease the discomfort caused by the breach in protocol. But Zarika stood quietly in the back of the room, her regal posture unchanged. Her eyes, however, told a different story. There was something in the way she watched Jackson, a flicker of curiosity, of something more than the silent reverence that her people had been taught to show. For Jackson, the rest of the meeting passed in a blur. He could feel the eyes of the Vantari warriors on him at all times, their silent judgment weighing heavily upon him. But it wasn't the warriors he was focused on. It was Zarika. She had stirred something within him, something that went beyond diplomacy, beyond peace negotiations. There was a hidden depth to the Vantari society, one that Jackson had only glimpsed for a brief moment, and he was determined to understand it. After the meeting, as the Vantari delegation retired to their chambers, Jackson found himself wandering the halls of the council building. The echoes of his footsteps seemed louder in the vast, cold chambers, and the weight of the silence around him pressed down on his shoulders. The Vantari had a way of keeping their emotions locked away, their faces masks of stoicism. But Jackson could sense that beneath the surface something was shifting. The encounter with Zarika had done more than just break an unspoken rule. It had planted a seed of doubt in the hearts of those who believed that the Vantari traditions could never be questioned. Jackson's thoughts were interrupted when he heard the sound of soft footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Zarika standing there alone. The warriors who had always accompanied her were nowhere in sight. It was as though she had slipped away from her duties, breaking free from the watchful eyes of her people for just a moment. She was different from the other females Jackson had seen on Vantari Prime. While they wore ceremonial robes, Zarika's attire was simple and practical, a sign of her higher status but also a quiet rebellion against the constraints of her society. "You must be careful." Zarika's voice was low, but her words carried an unmistakable weight. "You've stirred something that cannot be easily undone." Jackson blinked, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. He had expected the council to be his primary concern, not the Vantari female who had been kept in the shadows for so long. But as he looked at Zarika, he could see the silent strength in her eyes, the strength of someone who had been forced to live by rules she did not believe in. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Jackson said, his voice steady. "I only saw you as a person, not as an object of worship or fear." Zarika's expression softened slightly, though there was still a guarded air about her. "That is the problem," she said. "You see me as a person. My people do not. To them I am sacred, something to be hidden away, not to be acknowledged or understood. You've broken a rule that has held us together for centuries." Jackson could hear the underlying sadness in her words, and for the first time, he realized the depth of the problem facing the Vantari. Their strength, their unmatched power, had come at the cost of their humanity. The very traditions that had allowed them to survive for so long were now suffocating them. The Vantari warriors were powerful, yes, but they were trapped in a cycle of endless war, a war that would eventually destroy them if they didn't change. "I understand," Jackson said, his voice gentle, "but change is coming whether you want it or not. Your people can't keep living like this. You can't keep hiding away the people who are the foundation of your society." Zarika's gaze flickered to the ground for a moment before meeting Jackson's eyes again. "You don't understand," she said softly. "It's not that simple. The Vantari are bound by a code that we cannot break. If we do, everything will fall apart." Jackson took a step closer to her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He didn't know how to fix the problems of an entire race, but he knew that something had to change. "Sometimes breaking the code is the only way to save it," he said. "You've already started something. Don't be afraid to see it through." Zarika's eyes narrowed slightly, as if considering his. "You don't know what you're asking. You don't understand what it means to defy our traditions." Jackson took another step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "I understand more than you think. You deserve to be seen for who you are, not what your people expect you to be. You deserve freedom, Zarika, not just from your society, but from the chains of tradition that have held you back." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Finally, Zarika spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You're asking me to change everything I've ever known. Do you really believe that's possible?" Jackson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I believe in you, and I believe in the possibility of change. It starts with one person, one choice. You don't have to do it alone." For the first time since their conversation had started, Zarika's gaze softened. She had always carried the weight of her people's traditions, but now in Jackson's presence, she felt a flicker of something new, a spark of hope. It was a dangerous feeling, one that could cost her everything, but it was a feeling she couldn't ignore. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I'm willing to try." Jackson smiled gently, a sense of quiet relief washing over him. "That's all anyone can ask for." As they stood there side by side in the vast halls of the Vantari Council, a new chapter began to unfold. It wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of something far more significant, a story of defiance, of courage, and of the struggle for a future where the voices of the silenced could finally be heard. And no matter the cost, Jackson and Zarika would see it through together. Days passed after Jackson's quiet exchange with Zarika, but the tension in Vantari Prime was palpable. The Vantari, once known for their pride and fearsome power, had begun to stir in ways that no one had anticipated. The small, seemingly insignificant act of recognition between Jackson and Zarika had rippled through their society like a shockwave. To the warriors who had always followed the harsh, unwavering traditions of their people, the very idea that a human, an outsider, could acknowledge one of their sacred females was a betrayal of everything they had been taught. But for Zarika, that simple gesture was the spark she had been waiting for. Zarika had always known that something was wrong. She had spent her life in the shadow of her people's traditions, watching as the Vantari warriors marched into battle, never questioning the bloodshed or the cost. She had been revered, but she had also been locked away, never seen, never heard, and never allowed to choose her own path. The Vantari had always told her that her role was to be a symbol of strength, a living relic of the past, but Jackson had seen her as more than that. He had seen her as a person, a woman with her own desires, fears, and hopes. It was a revelation that had shaken Zarika to her core. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, and now she was beginning to question everything she had ever known about her people and their unbreakable traditions. She could not ignore the growing sense of rebellion within her heart, even though she knew the consequences of defying her culture. She had witnessed the power of the Vantari traditions firsthand. Breaking them could mean not only her own downfall, but the destruction of everything she had ever known. Yet the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the Vantari could not survive like this. Their warriors were fierce, yes, but they were also isolated in their own rigid beliefs. The birth rate among their species was plummeting, and their strength was slowly fading. They were a society built on a foundation of fear of change, fear of the unknown. And Zarika knew that if they continued to cling to their past, they would destroy themselves. It was during one of the quiet moments between the human delegation and the Vantari leaders that Zarika found herself standing alone. In the gardens of Silarth, the capital city, the day was drawing to a close and the fading light bathed the city in a golden glow. Zarika stood at the edge of the garden, her eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, the knowledge that every step she took now would alter the course of her people's future. It was then that Jackson approached her again, his figure emerging from the shadows of the garden. Unlike the warriors who always seemed to tower over her, Jackson had an unassuming presence. He didn't stand like a warrior ready for battle, but like a man who had learned to listen and observe. That was what made him different. And that was why Zarika had come to trust him. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Jackson's voice broke the silence, his words soft but direct. Zarika turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "How could I not? I've spent my entire life bound by traditions I didn't choose. But now I see the cracks in our society. I see how our people are suffering because we refuse to adapt." Jackson nodded, understanding her words more than he let on. He had spent his life studying species like the Vantari, proud ancient races that were too often stuck in their own ways. He had seen the patterns, the cycles of decline that came from refusal to change. But he also knew that change, when it came, was never easy. And for a race like the Vantari, change was a terrifying concept. "Your people are afraid," Jackson said, his voice steady. "They're afraid of losing their identity, their strength. But you don't have to lose who you are to evolve, Zarika. You can break free from these traditions and still be strong." Zarika's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of doubt in them. "You don't understand. If I speak out, if I challenge the council, I could lose everything. My family, my status, everything I've ever known could be taken from me." Jackson stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're already losing it, Zarika. You're losing everything by staying silent. Your people are dying, and you're just standing by, watching it happen." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Zarika closed her eyes, the weight of her people's fate settling on her shoulders. She had always known, deep down, that the Vantari were on a path of self-destruction, but she had never considered that she might be the one to change. That was the problem. No one ever considered that the ones who held power, the ones who could change the future, were the very ones who had been silenced for centuries. "I don't know if I can do it," Zarika whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Jackson's expression softened, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are stronger than you think, and you're not alone in this. There are others who want change, Zarika. You just have to lead them. Zarika opened her eyes, meeting his gaze for the first time in a long while. There was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, a belief in her that she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time, Zarika saw herself as more than just a tool of tradition. She saw herself as a leader. Maybe it's time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's time to start breaking the chains. Jackson smiled, a sense of quiet pride swelling in his chest. It is, and when you do, you'll be surprised at how many people will follow. The next few days were filled with an undercurrent of tension. Zarika had already made up her mind. She would no longer be a silent figure in her people's society. She would no longer accept the role that had been forced upon her. She was ready to challenge the very foundation of Vantari culture, even if it meant risking everything. But as she stood at the edge of the council chamber one evening, staring at the grand doors ahead, she felt a pang of fear. The Vantari were a proud people, and their elders were not known for their mercy. The council would not take kindly to her defiance. But the truth was, Zarika no longer cared about their anger. The time for silence had passed. The time for change had arrived. She turned to Jackson, who stood by her side. His presence gave her the strength she needed. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm. "Let's show them that the Vantari can change." And with that, Zarika walked through the doors of the council chamber, ready to face the consequences of her actions. The future of her people was in her hands, and she was no longer afraid to fight for it. The battle for the future of the Vantari had begun, and Zarika was no longer just a silent figure in the shadows. She was the voice of change. Zarika's heart raced as she stood before the council, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The grand council hall was filled with the elite leaders of the Vantari, their imposing figures seated in an arrangement that seemed designed to intimidate. At the head of the room, the matriarch sat with an air of unyielding authority, her piercing eyes fixed on Zarika. The room fell silent as she stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. For the first time in her life, Zarika didn't feel like the silent figure in the back of the room. She wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a force that could no longer be ignored. The Vantari Council, with its strict codes of conduct and unwavering traditions, had always been a place of power, where decisions were made that shaped the fate of entire generations. But now, Zarika had come to disrupt that order. She had come to challenge everything that the Vantari stood for. The room buzzed with hushed whispers as the elders exchanged glances, their disapproval palpable in the air. The matriarch as always remained silent, her gaze never leaving Zarika. Zarika stood tall, her posture firm and unyielding. Her thoughts raced, but her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "I stand here today not as a mere figurehead, not as a female bound by the chains of tradition, but as a person who deserves the same rights as any warrior of our people." The words came from a place deep inside her, a place she had never dared to explore until now. For the first time, she felt as though she was truly speaking her truth. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes narrowing with disdain. The matriarch's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You speak of equality, Zarika," she said, her voice cold and calculating. "But you must understand, our ways have kept us strong for millennia. What you propose is nothing short of rebellion. Do you truly believe that the foundation of our society can be torn down so easily?" Zarika's gaze never wavered. "No, I don't believe it will be easy, but I believe it is necessary. For too long, we have allowed our people to wither under the weight of our own traditions. We are a race of warriors, yes, but we are also a race of individuals. We cannot continue to sacrifice our future for the sake of a past that no longer serves us." The matriarch's eyes flickered with something akin to concern, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "And what of our people, Zarika? What of our warriors? You think they will simply follow you? The strength of the Vantari lies in our unity, in our unshakable loyalty to our traditions. Without them, we are nothing. Zarika felt the heat of the council's gaze bearing down on her, but she stood her ground. The strength of the Vantari lies not in blind obedience, but in our ability to adapt. We cannot continue to hide our women behind walls, expecting them to remain silent forever. It is not strength to bind half of our people and call it unity. It is weakness, and if we do not change, we will be left behind as a relic of the past. The matriarch rose slowly from her seat, her robe sweeping the floor as she stepped down from the platform. The other council members followed suit, their towering forms surrounding Zarika, creating a ring of silent pressure. You speak of change, but change comes at a price, the matriarch said, her voice low and threatening. You would challenge the very essence of what it means to be Vantari. You would tear apart the very fabric of our culture. And for what? A fleeting hope that the future will be kinder to us? Zarika felt the weight of the matriarch's words, but it did not break her resolve. She had already come too far to turn back. I would tear down these walls, matriarch, because I believe in the future of our people. I believe that we are stronger when we stand together, not when we hide behind the shadows of tradition. If that is treason, then I will gladly wear that title. But I will not stand by and watch our people crumble because we are too afraid to change. The silence that followed her declaration was thick, almost suffocating. Zarika could feel the council's eyes on her, their judgment weighing heavily in the air. She knew that this was a turning point, a moment in history that could either save her people or doom them. But she also knew that, for the first time in her life, she had spoken her truth. And no matter the outcome, that truth would not be silenced. The matriarch's gaze hardened and she turned to the other council members. This is an act of defiance, she said, her voice filled with cold authority. Zarika has broken the laws of our people, and she must face the consequences. We cannot allow this rebellion to go unpunished. She must be exiled from our society. The words hit Zarika like a physical blow. Exile. It was the ultimate punishment, the ultimate rejection. To be cast out of Vantari society was to be condemned to a life of isolation, cut off from everything she had ever known. But even in the face of such a harsh punishment, Zarika stood tall. She had already made her choice. She would not back down. I accept your judgment, Zarika said, her voice steady. But know this, you will never silence me. You will never silence the truth that I speak. I will fight for the future of our people even if it means standing alone. The matriarch's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was gone in an instant. So be it, she said, her voice cold and final. You are exiled from Vantari society. You will be cast out and you will never return. Zarika felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as the council session ended. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud still struck her like a blow. As she was escorted from the chamber, her thoughts turned to the future. She had made her choice, and now she would see it through no matter the cost. As Zarika stepped outside the council hall, the weight of her exile settled upon her. The vast plains of Vantari Prime stretched out before her, empty and desolate. But in the distance she could see a faint glimmer of hope. The future was uncertain and the road ahead would be difficult. But Zarika knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. She had broken the chains that had bound her, and now she would fight to lead her people into a new era. The Vantari would have to change, or they would cease to exist. And if no one else would lead them, then Zarika would be the one to show them the way. But she could not do it alone. She needed allies. And as she looked toward the horizon, she knew that there were others like her, those who were tired of the old ways and ready for something new. The rebellion had only just begun, and Zarika was ready to lead it. The night air was thick with a quiet unease as Zarika stood on the edge of the wilderness, looking out over the vast expanse of Vantari Prime. The planet, once a symbol of her people's might, now felt foreign, alien to her. The Grand Council Hall, where she had once stood in reverence, seemed a distant memory, now overshadowed by the weight of her exile. She was no longer the revered daughter of tradition. She was an outsider, a traitor in the eyes of her people. But, even as the cold night winds whipped against her face, Zarika felt a strange sense of freedom. It was the freedom that came with knowing she had spoken the truth, even if it cost her everything. The harsh reality of her exile had set in, but it no longer seemed like a punishment. It was a new beginning. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now she had to see it through. She had no illusions about the path ahead. It would not be easy. The Vantari were a proud and stubborn race, and they would not easily accept a shift in their long-held traditions. The warriors, with their unshakable loyalty to the old ways, would never welcome the idea of change. And the matriarch, the embodiment of Vantari tradition, would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. But Zarika had seen something different in the younger warriors, the ones who were beginning to question their place in a dying society. It wasn't just the humans who had sparked a change in her. It was the growing unrest among the Vantari youth. They were tired of living under the weight of traditions that no longer served them. And Zarika, for the first time, felt like she could be the one to lead them out of the darkness. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Jackson approaching, his familiar figure outlined against the faint light of the rising moons. His presence brought her a sense of calm, a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. Despite her exile, despite the odds stacked against her, Jackson had always been there, offering quiet support, encouraging her to stand tall when she wanted to give in. "You're still out here," Jackson said, his voice calm but laced with concern. "I thought you'd be resting." Zarika shook her head, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "There is no rest when the future of my people is at stake," she replied. "I've been exiled, Jackson, cast out from everything I've ever known. But I will not back down. I will fight for them. For us." Jackson stepped closer, his eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to do this alone, Zarika. I may not be able to fight your battles for you, but I can help you gather support. There are others who feel the same way you do. You've already begun something, and now it's time to build on that." Zarika's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "But how do I lead them? How do I convince my people to follow me when they've been taught to fear change for so long?" Jackson smiled gently. "You lead by example. You show them that change is possible. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy, but if you stand strong, others will stand with you." Zarika nodded, her heart swelling with the belief that perhaps change wasn't as impossible as it seemed. She had already defied the council. She had already taken the first step toward breaking free from the chains of tradition. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was no longer afraid. The Vantari needed change, and she would be the one to bring it to them. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of urgency. Zarika knew that time was running out for her people. The council's purge was imminent, and the Vantari were growing more restless by the day. But Zarika also knew that now was the time to act. She could not wait for the council to make the first move. The revolution had to start with her. She spent her days in the wilderness gathering allies from among the younger Vantari warriors who had already shown signs of dissent. These were the ones who, like her, were tired of living in the shadows of the past. They were ready for something new, something better, and they were willing to risk everything to achieve it. Zarika's followers were few at first, just a small group of warriors and civilians who had grown disillusioned with the council's iron grip on their lives. But as the days passed, their numbers began to grow. The more they saw Zarika's courage, the more they believed in her vision for the future. She was no longer just a symbol of rebellion. She was a beacon of hope. The warriors who once feared the repercussions of standing against tradition were now beginning to realize that their fear was the very thing that had kept them trapped in an endless cycle of destruction. Zarika's influence spread like wildfire, reaching even the most distant corners of Vantari society. The rebellion was no longer just a whispered idea. It was a movement that was gaining momentum with each passing day, and Zarika knew that it was only a matter of time before the council took notice. But even as her movement grew, the pressure to act became more intense. The council's purge was already underway, and Zarika could feel the eyes of the Vantari warriors upon her every time she stepped out into the open. She was a marked woman, a traitor in the eyes of the council, and with every step she took, the danger of being caught grew. One evening, as the sun began to set over the distant hills, Zarika found herself standing before her followers once again. They had gathered in the wilderness, hidden from the eyes of the council, waiting for her to speak. She could see the hope in their eyes, the belief that she was the one who could lead them to freedom. But the road ahead would not be easy. The council would stop at nothing to crush their rebellion. "This is it," Zarika said, her voice strong and steady. "Tonight we make our move. Tonight we show the Vantari that we are not afraid to change. We will not let them control us any longer. We will rise." Her words ignited a fire in the hearts of her followers. They were ready to fight for the future, ready to challenge the council's rule. They knew the risks, but they also knew that change was worth fighting for. As the night descended upon Vantari Prime, Zarika's small army of rebels moved quietly through the wilderness, preparing for the battle that would decide the future of their people. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by a society that would do anything to protect its traditions. But Zarika had one thing the council could never take away: the will to fight for what was right. In the darkness of the night, the first steps of the revolution were taken, and no matter the cost, Zarika and her followers knew one thing: they would never stop fighting for a future where freedom, equality, and change could flourish. The battle for the future of the Vantari had begun, and Zarika, once in exile, now stood at the head of a revolution, ready to lead her people into a new era.